The state of Montana, located in the northwest United States, is known for its vast swathes of prairies, forests, and mountains, earning it the moniker of the Big Sky State or Big Sky Country. While it is the fourth largest state in the United States, it has one of the lowest populations, ranking 46th of the 50 states. Montana's economy is driven primarily by mining, farming, ranching, and the state has seen a large increase in tourism over the years as many people flock to Montana to experience the beautiful landscapes, outdoor activities, and the unique national parks that lie within its borders. Along with the world-famous Yellowstone National Park, Glacier National Park, located in the northwestern portion of the state, is a popular destination for tourists as well. And while it's easy to enjoy the scenery and nature within the park as a visitor, it's also vital that visitors remember that there are also many dangers that lurk within the Montana wilderness. Grizzly bears are a subspecies of brown bear found in North America, weighing between 400 and 750 pounds on average and standing up to 10 feet tall on their hind legs. These massive apex predators are feared by even other predators at the top of the food chain, such as wolves, who will typically avoid confrontation with grizzly bears whenever possible, as grizzlies are powerful creatures that can hold their own in a fight, even against a pack of wolves. Grizzly bears, while primarily carnivores, have an omnivorous diet and are gifted with a powerful sense of smell that aids them in finding potential food sources to further fuel their massive bodies. Humans partaking in outdoor activities in areas known to be inhabited by grizzly bears must take great care to secure food and other items that could potentially attract a curious grizzly bear and trigger confrontation with these powerful predators. On August 12, 1967, wildfires stemming from thunderstorms that had occurred in the previous days had filled Glacier National Park with a smoky haze that enveloped much of the park. However, these fires and the haze did little to dissuade the usual crowd of summer visitors from visiting the park, and despite the fires, it was more or less business as usual in Glacier National Park. At the time, a popular tourist activity was to see grizzly bears as they fed from the garbage dump behind a building within Glacier known as the Granite Park Chalet. It was so popular, in fact, that park officials had installed bleachers for viewing the grizzlies as they made their daily trip to feast on the garbage within the dump. And much like the human activity in the park, despite the fires, the grizzlies continued to show up daily to feast on the garbage, much to many of the tourists' delight. While the park officials knew that such a dynamic between humans and bears was likely unhealthy, the bears within Glacier had been generally shy around humans, and the park had not seen any attacks for decades in 1967. However, 20 miles from the Granite Park Chalet at the Trout Lake campgrounds, several campers had reported a particularly mangy grizzly bear they'd seen wandering about the campgrounds, raiding campsites for food, whilst the occupants of the campsites were away. The campers unfortunate enough to have their campsite ransacked by the bear noted that this grizzly bear had been particularly aggressive in its search for food, as it had ripped apart tents, sleeping bags, chewed into canned foods, and shredded through backpacks in its search for food. But as the grizzlies within Glacier were thought to be particularly friendly, when these incidents were reported to park rangers, they were met with indifference and amusement rather than concern. On the evening of August 12th, Roy Ducott and Julie Helgeson set up a camp in the campground behind the Granite Park Chalet for a wilderness overnight camping excursion, or in layman's terms, camping under the stars or camping without using a tent. The pair were well aware that grizzlies lived in the area, as both were sophomores in college that were working in the park seasonally, but they didn't fear a potential encounter with the bears, as they had a reputation within the park for being friendly and non-aggressive towards humans. The duo proceeded to set up their camp and settled in for the night. However, at around 12:30 a.m. the following morning, the campers were awoken by a horrid stench permeating throughout the air. Julie was the first to realize that they were just feet from a large grizzly bear that loomed above them, and whispered to Roy to play dead and told him not to make a sound, as grizzly bears will continue an attack until they perceive that their target is dead. Almost as soon as she had finished whispering this to Roy, the bear began to attack Roy, who managed to remain silent as the bear bit into his flesh on his shoulder, left arm, and both legs. The grizzly then shifted its focus to Julie, and as the bear began to maul her, she instinctively screamed as loud as she could for help. As Roy continued to play dead, he heard Julie's screams becoming increasingly distant, and quickly realized that the bear had begun to drag her down the hill behind the campground. Roy then ran to a nearby camper and pounded on the door, awakening the man inside, who upon seeing Roy in his bloodied state, began to wrap his wounds with a sleeping bag in order to slow the bleeding, and then warned other campers within the campground about the danger lurking within it. The commotion had awoken guests staying at the Granite Park Chalet, and a small search party of rangers was sent to investigate the source of the screams, and this search party soon came across a pair of campers from the campground perched on the roof of a trail cabin. The party called out to them, "Is everything okay?" which was met with an immediate "no" from the couple atop the trail cabin. Upon descending into the campgrounds further, the small party of park rangers, along with a doctor, quickly began to tend to Roy's wounds and evacuated him back to the chalet on a makeshift stretcher. They then called for a helicopter, which rushed Roy to a nearby hospital for treatment. After hearing what had happened to Roy and successfully evacuating him, the search party deliberated whether to search for Julie in the pitch-black woods behind the campground, and after this short deliberation, they decided that despite the risk, they had to search for her in case she was still alive, dispatching a larger search party of about a dozen men to mitigate the risk of a second attack on one of the members of the search party. By the time they had departed from the chalet, it had been 2 hours since Julie had been dragged away by the bear, and the search party soon came across a trail of blood leading through the woods to Julie, who was still alive. Her wounds were so grievous that the search party was shocked that she could still be alive, and as the doctor began to inspect her wounds further, she quietly whispered to him, "It hurts." The doctor realized that her lungs had been punctured by the bear's teeth, making it increasingly difficult for her to breathe, and her right forearm had been chewed down to the bone, with her legs badly mangled with bite wounds as well, which were alarmingly no longer bleeding. The party quickly fashioned another makeshift stretcher and brought Julie back to the chalet, which had a room that had been converted into a makeshift operating room while the party searched for her, and the 2 doctors on site quickly began to operate on her. However, they soon realized that she was just mere moments from death, and that she had lost so much blood that there was no chance she would survive her injuries. The doctors then gave her an injection of painkillers to ease her suffering, and comforted her in her final moments before she died of her injuries at 4:12 a.m. That same evening, 20 miles away, near Trout Lake, a group of 5, also seasonal employees, along with a puppy, planned for a quiet excursion of camping and fishing that evening. Only one member of the group had any experience with camping in the woods, a 16-year-old boy named Paul Dunn, who was also the youngest member of the group. After setting up their camp, they hung their food in a tree, and 4 of them began to fish for their dinner in the lake, leaving behind 19-year-old Michelle Kuntz to supervise the puppy and the campsite while the rest of the group fished. Paul was the first to catch a fish and brought it back to the camp and began to cook it just as darkness was falling. While Paul was tending to his fish, Michelle noticed what she thought was a grizzly bear lurking in the woods very near to their camp, and upon hearing this, the rest of the group rushed back to the camp to investigate. They then decided to retreat from their camp as the grizzly had been sighted no more than a dozen feet away from them, and after retreating about 50 yards, They watched as a small, thin, mangy grizzly bear tore through their camp, eating their freshly caught fish, and watched with disbelief as the bear continued to ravage the camp, tearing up their backpacks and other equipment in an apparent search for more food. After finding nothing further, the bear retreated back into the woods from which it came. Since the sun had fully set at this point, the group decided that they would set up a camp where they currently were, as from what they knew, grizzlies would not accost humans if they did not provoke them, and thus they quickly gathered what they could from the old campsite, leaving behind some cookies to hopefully potentially distract the bear from their new location. They then settled into their new campsite and went to sleep. However, at around 4 a.m. in the early morning hours of August 13th, a member of the group, 20-year-old Denise Huckle, was awoken by the sounds of splashing in the nearby lake and woke the rest of the group up to investigate. Upon peering down the hill towards the lake, they saw what looked like the outline of the grizzly bear from earlier making its way from the lake towards their previous campsite, where it then appeared to find the cookies they had left. Since it was so close to sunrise, several members of the group decided to go back to sleep, but Denise remained wide awake, keeping an eye on the bear while also keeping a tight hold on the puppy. About a half an hour later, Denise saw the bear hurtling towards their camp and immediately retreated inside her sleeping bag as the rest of the group was jarred awake by the sounds of the bear tearing through their camp. After a short while, the bear bit into the sleeping bag of Paul Dunn, grabbing a hold of his sweatshirt with its teeth, before then releasing it. Paul took this opportunity to wriggle out of his sleeping bag and began to run away as the bear reared its claws, standing upright on its hind legs, and Paul managed to clamber his way up into a tree before he called out for the rest of the group to do the same. The bear then turned its attention to the sleeping bag of Ray Nosek, age 23, as his younger brother, 21-year-old Ron, and Denise took the opportunity to emerge from their sleeping bags and run towards the shoreline as they struggled with the puppy. Ray then bolted from his sleeping bag as soon as he noticed that the bear had turned its attention to Michelle's sleeping bag and joined Ron and Denise at the shore of the lake before they all managed to ascend into a tree with the puppy. As they were climbing the tree, they heard Michelle begin to scream as the bear bit into her flesh through her sleeping bag and heard her call out, "He's ripping my arm." Soon after that, they heard her scream out again, "Oh my God, I'm dead." The horrified campers then watched the grizzly drag her sleeping bag away from the campsite and into the woods. As soon as the bear had disappeared with Michelle, the group grabbed their shoes and ran to the nearest ranger station, alerting authorities of their horrific experience. After dawn had broken, Paul and Ron led a ranger to the site of their camps, where they found the site exactly as the group of friends had described it, and they quickly began to search the woods for any traces of Michelle. It didn't take long for them to find Michelle's remains, which had been so badly gnawed and mangled by the grizzly bear that the ranger who accompanied the boys to the site, a man named Leonard Landa, described it as the most horrific thing he had ever seen. In the immediate aftermath of the incidents, park rangers began a hunt for the offending grizzly bears, and by the evening of August 13th, they had slain 2 grizzly bears in the area behind the Granite Park Chalet and another grizzly bear in the vicinity of Trout Lake. However, park officials and other wildlife experts were at a loss for an explanation as to how 2 attacks in the same night could have occurred. There was much debate and contention in the weeks following the attacks, with some park rangers speculating that the lightning strikes that had caused the wildfires could have agitated the bears, or that the wildfires themselves could have driven the bears to more aggressive behaviors, but each of these suggestions were refuted by other experts on grizzly bear behaviors. Over 1 year later, an official report about the attacks was released by Glacier National Park officials, which stated that they had not found an exact reason for why the 2 grizzlies had been so uncharacteristically aggressive that night, although the rangers that killed the grizzly that had killed Michelle Kuntz found that it had shards of glass embedded in its gums, which they think could have made the animal more aggressive. Ultimately, while they couldn't pinpoint an exact reason for the attacks, Glacier National Park did make several changes to the operation of the park to reduce chances of contact between grizzly bears and humans within the park. They removed the bleachers and dump from behind the Granite Park Chalet and began strictly enforcing the previously unenforced rule of not feeding the bears, and reports of bears in the campgrounds were treated much more seriously than previously before. Thank you all for watching.